Hi everybody. This lecture is going to be about the difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments. So we've talked about propositions, we've talked about what arguments are. Arguments are just a series of propositions or true or false statements that support a definite conclusion. Arguments are composed of premises and conclusions. But there are two general categories of arguments that we're going to be studying in this course. One is deductive arguments and the other is inductive arguments. So let's start with deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are arguments that attempt to prove their conclusions. Inductive arguments, in contrast, well, not really contrasting, but in difference, inductive arguments are arguments that support or that make it probable that their conclusions are true. So, in a deductive argument, a definition of deduction is that a deductive argument is one that attempts to prove its conclusion, or one could say there's a necessary inferential link between premises and conclusions, which means that in a good deductive argument, one that we would call valid, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, true premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So you know that if you can break certain forms of deductive arguments down, that if you have true premises, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. And that would be in a valid deductive argument form. However, there are other forms, invalid deductive argument forms. They still attempt to prove their conclusions, but the fact that they have false premises leads to, if in an invalid deductive argument, if you have true premises, it doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion being true of necessity. So another way to talk about deduction is that they have a necessary inferential link. And it's always easier, instead of using all this technical jargon, let's just look at an example. So I'm going to erase this for a second. So just remember, inductive arguments support their conclusions, deductive arguments attempt to prove their conclusions. Now let's look at a deductive argument that has a necessary inferential link. Tom is taller than Rebecca. Rebecca is taller than Frodo. Frodo! Okay, so these are two premises. Tom is taller than Rebecca. Rebecca is taller than Frodo. What is the necessary inferential step that your mind takes in order, what necessary conclusion has to follow? Well, if T is greater than R and R is greater than F, you probably all remember this. If T is greater than R and R is greater than F, then T must of necessity be greater than F. So Tom is taller than Frodo. And this is actually a valid form of deduction. And we can change this form into a specific form called hypothetical syllogism. It's currently not in that form, but if we were to change these to if-then statements, what are called conditional statements, if we said if Tom, well, actually, that doesn't work. Scrap what I just said. Yeah, that's not going to work. But there is a way to make it work. But again, in this form, sorry, just scrap what I said about hypothetical syllogism. This is but it's still a valid form. We'll talk about hypothetical syllogism later. But Tom being taller than Rebecca, Rebecca being taller than Frodo, Tom is of necessity taller than Frodo. So I guess here we could say kind of an AAA form. All people identical to Tom are taller than all people identical to Rebecca. All people identical to Rebecca are taller than all people identical to Frodo. Therefore, all people identical to Tom are taller than all people identical to Frodo. But you can see here that there's a necessary link. It's impossible. If these two premises are true, then the conclusion must of necessity follow. So this is a valid form. Remember, a valid deductive argument is one in which true premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But again, not all deductive argument forms are valid, even though they still fall into deduction. Okay, so there's a necessary inferential link in deduction. Now, let's look at another way that we can find out about deductive examples of arguments. The third is the structure of the argument itself. So often, when you're looking for deductive arguments, you'll see that the argument has a specific structure. And if you see words like all, no, some are not, of necessity, it follows of necessity that ... You can begin to think in the realm of deduction, although that's not always the case. So if you see these words, it's a good indication that you might be dealing with a deductive argument. Often deductive arguments take on the form of a syllogism as well. A syllogism is just an argument that has two premises and a conclusion. And so if you see something like, all cats are mammals. Okay, we see the word all, right? And then we have all mammals are warm-blooded. So we have two premises and then a conclusion. What is the necessary deductively valid conclusion that would follow from this? If all cats are mammals and all mammals are warm-blooded, then we know that all cats are warm-blooded. So again, this is a valid form. Really, what we would want to do is flip these two premises, but again, that doesn't matter right now. But this is a valid form, because these two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But somebody might say, and really we should have warm-blooded creatures here, but all cats are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded creatures. Therefore, what if somebody said all warm-blooded creatures are cats? Well, we can see here that that would be an invalid form of reasoning. And you might see this in your everyday life. You probably recognize sometimes, just from intuition or your own ideas, that some people's arguments are wrong or that they're invalid. And this happens, now in this example, you wouldn't see this as much because it's a pretty simplistic example. But if we change these categories to things that you didn't know about, or if we change them into more complex categories, you would still know that it's invalid reasoning because you could break it down into the categories itself. But it doesn't follow from these two premises of necessity that all warm-blooded creatures are cats. But this is still a deductive argument. It's just an invalid deductive argument. And again, we'll talk more about validity and invalidity throughout the course in ways to prove that an argument is invalid or valid. Okay, so the structure of the argument itself can help us determine whether or not the argument is deductive. So we look for these words, but then there are certain argument structures that usually indicate deduction. So mathematical arguments. 2 + 2 = 4. Or you might remember from geometry, if side angle side theorem, if two sides and the angle between those sides are congruent in two triangles, then of necessity those two triangles are congruent. So arguments from math are often deductive arguments, although there are probably some arguments in math that are not, like in more theoretical contexts. But ultimately, probably most mathematicians would hope that they could prove by deduction. their proofs. An argument from definition is another form of argument that is a deductive argument. Argument from definition. And so if I say about myself, Justin is a bachelor, and we use this example all the time. So Justin is a bachelor, therefore Justin is an unmarried man. Then that would be a deductive argument. It would follow of necessity that if you are one thing, and then we replace that category or that concept with the definition that precisely defines that concept, then of necessity you are that thing. So if you are a bachelor, you're an unmarried man. If you are married, then you are not a bachelor. That would be not really an argument from definition, but it would still be a valid form of reasoning. Modus tollens. Okay, so arguments from definitions. Categorical syllogisms are also deductive argument forms. So a categorical syllogism is a deductive argument that has two premises and a conclusion. Now you could have inductive arguments that have two premises and a conclusion and very closely resemble categorical syllogisms, but categorical syllogisms of themselves are deductive arguments. So let's go back to the example that I just used. In a categorical syllogism, we tend to use four different types of propositions: all SRP, no SRP, some SRP, and some SR not P. So we can create a categorical syllogism here. And the three terms in a categorical syllogism are the subject term, the predicate term, and the middle term. Notice that each term occurs twice in the argument. So the predicate term occurs in the first premise, the subject term in the second, and then the middle term is the one that appears twice in the premises. But whenever you see like all, no, some, or some are not, and you have two premises and a conclusion, that's a categorical syllogism. So again, if we use these terms that encompass all categories or no categories or some categories, so when I say something like all MRP, what I'm saying is that if I have a class P, then all the M's in the world fall under that class P. So can you think of a class M that would fall within class P? Correct. You're probably thinking the exact same thing I am. All hobbits are creatures that live in Middle Earth. So if we change M to hobbits and P to creatures that live in Middle Earth, so we'll call that M, then all hobbits are creatures that dwell in Middle Earth. Now, of course, that's a fake example, right? Or that's an imaginary example. However, it's important to recognize that in logic you can use those imaginary examples like the moon is made of cheese and things like that. But also notice these other words that we haven't been talking about. So I can change this to no MRP, all SRM, therefore some SRP. And in this case, this is an invalid form, but it's still a deductive form. And notice all of the premises in the conclusion abide by the no, all, some, or some are not. So the final form, categorical premise form that we can use here is some S are not P. Now it's not important right now to understand all four different propositions in categorical syllogisms. But I just want to show you a multiplicity of them so that you understand that whenever you see this form, you should immediately think deduction. Okay. So again, arguments from math, or mathematical arguments, arguments from definition, categorical syllogisms are all forms of deductive arguments. There are a couple more here. that I'm actually not going to talk about because we're going in deep initially, I know, and I want to talk about some other things before the lecture ends. So, but if you remember these three, and just syllogisms in general, will tend to be deductive. Now, once we talk about inductive arguments, you'll see why it's not always the case that that two premise arguments with a conclusion are not all syllogisms or all inductive or deductive. Okay, so inductive arguments. You'll remember the first thing I put up here was that inductive arguments support their conclusions. And support is the key term here. When we reason inductively, and don't think about the typical definition that you might find on Wikipedia or something where it says like induction is reasoning from the particular to the universal, and deduction is reasoning from the universal to the particular. That doesn't fly in logic. That's not the way that we define things. In logic, inductive arguments support conclusions, which means that we're trying to pile up as much evidence as possible, but still, it could be the case that our conclusion doesn't of necessity follow from the premises. And so, if you see words in arguments like probably, or likely, or you might just see it follows from this that in a majority of instances, any word that is not quite as strong as always or none of the time, you're going to tend to think that it's an inductive argument. So if I say, for example, if it rains, then we're not going to have a picnic. It's raining, therefore we're not going to have a picnic. That would be a deductive argument. But if I say, if it rains, then we're probably not going to have a picnic. It's raining, therefore we're probably not going to have a picnic. That would be an inductive argument, because it could still be the case that we have a picnic, even though the premises are true, and that it's raining. And so you can see that inductive arguments don't have as strong an inferential link. They don't attempt to prove their conclusions of necessity, or guarantee their conclusions. They support their conclusions. So even in the best possible inductive argument, there's still the chance that it would not be true, or that the conclusion doesn't of necessity follow. And the one prime example is the sun will rise tomorrow. So every day of my life, the sun has risen and gone down. Every day of every human's life before me, they've talked about the sun going up and coming down. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, that doesn't follow of necessity. Of course, it could be possibly, there is some minuscule possibility that the sun will not rise tomorrow. But you can notice that that's an inductive argument because it doesn't of necessity follow that the sun will rise just because I've experienced it every day of my life and every other human has experienced it every day of his or her life. And therefore, even the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow is an inductive inference that the mind makes. Okay, so, but there are some specific forms of inductive arguments that you should be familiar with as well. And one is predictions. And this is the weather argument, right? So, I live in San Diego, easiest weather job ever, right? But, so you see the weather person and they're like, hey, guess what? Tomorrow, there's this high pressure system here, and this is going to draw winds out to the west. And what's going to happen is this, and it's going to rain a lot tomorrow. So these are rain droplets coming down tomorrow. And what happens tomorrow when you walk outside? Well, it doesn't rain. So based on all the factors that were leading up to that prediction, it seemed like it was going to rain. But again, because it didn't rain of necessity, then that person is making an inductive inference. And anytime that we try to anticipate through prediction, we're making an inductive inference. It's never the case that, because precisely by definition, a prediction occurs when you do not know the final outcome. So many people right now are predicting that that Florida State is going to beat Auburn in the college football championship. But still, they don't know with certainty, and it could definitely be the case that Auburn wins. And if Auburn does, I'm going to win a lot of money. No, that's not true. I don't bet. I don't gamble specifically or formally. So predictions. Okay, predictions are forms of inductive argument. Argument from analogy. Whenever somebody makes an analogy between two things, like this is like that, and because this happened during, let's say, the Nixon administration, therefore, because these same conditions align with the Nixon administration, when we make the same decision now, it's going to be like that. It's going to be, and there would be a little bit of prediction mixed in there as well. But whenever you compare something to something else through the use of analogy, you're using inductive reasoning. And I've talked about one that I see regularly in student papers that's actually a false form of analogy. Students say that God is like the wind. You can't see it, but you know it's there. That's an example of analogical argumentation. So because you can't see the wind, but you know it's there, and God is like the wind, therefore you can't see God, but you know God is there. And again, we talked about why that doesn't work. The wind is composed of material particles. You can, in fact, see the wind numerous times in a tornado or a hurricane. When it's picking up dust and things, you can see it. And also you can feel it. And so the analogy doesn't hold in that instance, because if God manifested itself in a tornado or in a way that humans could actually walk outside and feel the cooling breeze of God on themselves all the time, then the analogy would work. But then there would be no debate about the existence of God in and of itself. And please don't draw any conclusions about what I believe about God. Just because I bring up the fact that that analogy doesn't work doesn't mean that I don't believe in God. But I'm not going to talk about whether I do or don't believe in God. I'm just going to talk about whether or not an analogy is an apt one to use when you're inductively reasoning about God. And that one is not. So it's important that you find another one for those who believe in God. Or don't even try to prove the existence of God at all. Anyway. All right, the third form of inductive reasoning is a generalization. This is one of the most prevalent as well as most dangerous forms of inductive reasoning. So whenever you take a specific smaller group and you make claims about the larger group based on the attributes of that smaller group, you're generalizing. And because you can't know for certain, or it doesn't follow of necessity, or it doesn't guarantee the conclusion, you're inductively reasoning because you're attempting to support your conclusion. Now, a good example here is quote-unquote welfare, whatever that means. I think people think that welfare is people getting money for free from the government or food or something like that. But there are other forms of welfare, Medicaid, support of troops who've been injured in war and have to retire early, and they get some sort of retirement benefits. That would be a form of the government providing resources to another human being within the society. So there are other forms of welfare, but anyway, you often hear like, oh, people on welfare are lazy. Well, that would be a generalization. That would be a hasty generalization. It's not the case that all people on welfare are lazy. And also we would need to define welfare, because if welfare is any sort of government benefit, then that would include, military troops and their families getting discounted food and other things at the commissaries or whatever. I'm not exactly familiar with all these things. It would include people who are who get their unemployment benefits extended because they've been fired or laid off. And so, first of all, we would need to define what welfare is. But anyway, the tendency to generalize, or generalizations fall under inductive argument reasoning. Be very careful about generalizations. If you don't use the right sample, if you don't have any evidence to back up your claim, then you cannot logically, in a sound or strong fashion, reason that your generalization is true. So it's always good to avoid things like well, women are this, or men are this, or whites are this, or African Americans are this, or people on welfare are this, or soldiers are that, or the United States military is this, or because within those large groups, there are smart and lazy people of all ethnicities. There are driven and undriven people of all ethnicities. Smart and not so smart people, lazy and driven. And usually people immediately, they understand when they're generalizing too hastily, because they'll say things like, well, everybody like that is like that. But there's this one person I know who's not like that, so, therefore, maybe I'm, overgeneralizing, right? Liberals are crybabies. Conservatives want to kill everybody and don't care about poor people. Any of those generalizations are invalid or unsound or weak forms of reasoning. So just avoid it. Don't generalize. Talk about the things that you know. And if you really want to make a generalization, make sure that you do the scientific research and read the articles and books that relate to it. Okay, an argument from authority. Also, another very dangerous form of reasoning. So whenever you use somebody as an authority to back up your claim, you're reasoning in an inductive fashion, because just because somebody is an authority doesn't necessarily mean that what they say is true or that your conclusion necessarily follows. So you could say that about me right now, and you'd be absolutely right to say that. So Justin, why are you telling me all this stuff? You're making an argument here that all of these forms are inductive arguments, but why should I believe you, right? That's just an inductive form. Well, I don't have any reason to try to lie to you, so that might be a good, way to account for whether or not I'm credible. I want you to succeed, which actually goes even further than just not wanting to lie to you. And some other reasons too. But anyway, whenever you use an authority, be very careful and also recognize that you're not reasoning deductively. So even the greatest authorities on different things in the world mess up sometimes, or they have theories that are wrong, or that have portions that are wrong. And of course, you should never use somebody who's not an authority as an authority. Like, who cares what Hulk Hogan thinks about Obama? Nobody should. You should care what Hulk Hogan thinks about the state of the World Wrestling Federation, because he probably knows a lot about the inner workings of that group. He probably knows how to make money, how to be profitable, what the market is. People seem to still love the tan with the weird mullet with the, kind of like the Abbott, with the bald on top and it's hanging down. So he's obviously an authority on the World Wrestling Federation. But if Hulk Hogan is talking about politics, probably shouldn't believe him. Why do people care so much what Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt think about world issues? Now, maybe I'm making a hasty generalization here, but if I want to know something about the economy in Vietnam, I should go find articles written by Vietnamese economists. And I should maybe consult business owners and see what the market tends to be for Vietnam. For example, I heard a story about Cambodia and how they produce extremely cheap clothing. And all of these clothing retailers go to Cambodia to make their clothes. And I heard it directly from a few factory owners and also from the people in the United States who contract with those people. Now, that's not enough information. I still need to do more. But I shouldn't care what Angelina Jolie says about Cambodia. I should care about what Cambodian social activists and politicians and economists think about the situation in Cambodia. So be careful about the authorities that you use here whenever you argue from an authority. Is saying that your parents taught you that a good reason for me to believe that what you're saying is true? No, unless your parent is an authority on the issue. There's a great scene from an old Saturday Night Live skit where they have a fake Hank Williams Jr., Chris Farley, talking about what he likes to do with his friends, and he's like, well, my friend wants me to get the Bocephus juices flowing, and then the guy says, well, your friend's out huffing paint in a barn, you know. So we need to be careful about who our authorities are. If somebody's not an authority, then we ought not use them as an authority. Okay, another form of inductive reasoning is causal inference. So a causal inference is a form of induction. So what did I just do, actually? You might say, well, you dropped the marker. Well, that's a causal inference. You're saying that I dropped the marker. You didn't see the word drop. What you saw was you saw my hand move and you saw the marker fall to the ground. But we make causal inferences all the time. We hear things like, if you do drugs, you know, the reason why this person went crazy was because they did drugs. They smoked marijuana, therefore that's why they started snorting cocaine. But we have to be very careful when we make causal inferences as well, because causality is a very complex thing. And we tend to think that we know all the reasons why something happened, or that we can pinpoint with some accuracy why outcomes emerge. But causal reasoning constantly is running into issues. And this is why it's so important in scientific experimentation that you try and maintain a low number of variables in relation to the scientific experiment, hopefully such that you're only changing one of the variables. It's important to do that because you don't know what caused the outcome. So for example, in an extended study of a population in terms of heart disease, you're trying to figure out why people in the United States get heart disease versus people who live in, let's say, like Greece. Why is there such a high level of heart disease in the US and not in Greece? And what they've done is they've monitored their eating habits. Well, there's some other issues there that are important that we should think about. We can't just say that because people in Greece eat differently than the people in the United States, they have a lower percentage of heart disease. Now, that might definitely be one major contributing factor. But if you're analyzing people in Greece who are heavy smokers and drinkers, then you might actually find that the heart disease rate goes up. If you're analyzing a population in the United States that tends to retain more salt in their bodies than another population, then you might see an increase in heart disease. So it's important that we don't draw causal inferences too strongly or too quickly, that we don't overgeneralize or hastily generalize in relation to causal inference. There are a lot of different factors that cause most things on Earth. Okay, so that's enough for now. So again, overview, and then we'll move into some specific examples in the next lecture. But deductive arguments attempt to prove their conclusions. There's a necessary inferential link between premises and conclusions. In a valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Inductive arguments attempt to support their conclusions, or they attempt to make it probable that the conclusion is true. However, no matter how strong an inductive argument is, it doesn't of necessity prove its conclusion, which means that the inferential link in induction between premises and conclusions is weaker than that of deduction. Deductive arguments include categorical syllogisms, hypothetical syllogisms, disjunctive syllogisms, mathematical arguments, arguments from definition. Inductive arguments include predictions, analogy. And you'll notice here in this list that these are all things that include some sort of probability. There is a probability that plays out here that makes the conclusion not quite as guaranteed as it would be in a deductive argument. Now, of course, we can flip back and forth between inductive and deductive arguments. We can change them, and that's what we'll talk about in our next lecture.